New Orleans always seemed to buzz with life, even in the quieter corners of the French Quarter. I loved walking through the winding streets, where the scent of beignet mingled with the earthy aroma of the river. It was chaotic and loud, but it was also home. For an artist like me, there was inspiration everywhere, from the sprawling oak trees to the street musicians who poured their souls into every note. But lately, I'd been stuck. My paintings felt lifeless, like I was churning out replicas of the same dull ideas. Bills were piling up, and I was considering taking on a second job to keep my studio afloat. That's why, on a rare day off, I decided to visit the art market on Decatur Street. Maybe I'd find a spark there. The market was lively as usual, with vendors hawking everything from vibrant canvases to handmade jewelry. I browsed aimlessly until I reached a small stall tucked in the corner, almost hidden behind a larger tent selling abstract sculptures. The stall wasn't much to look at. A rickety wooden table draped in faded purple cloth, a couple of mismatched chairs, and rows of handmade dolls. They weren't your typical rag dolls, though. These were disturbingly detailed. Their faces had an almost human quality, with glass eyes that seemed to follow your movements. Each one was dressed in delicate fabrics that looked like they had been salvaged from vintage gowns. The craftsmanship was remarkable, but there was something unnerving about them. Beautiful, aren't they? The voice startled me. I hadn't noticed the woman behind the table. She was old, ancient, really, with a face like cracked porcelain. Her hair was covered by a brightly patterned head wrap, and she wore layers of necklaces that clinked softly as she moved. Her smile revealed slightly crooked teeth, and her eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto mine with unsettling intensity. "Yeah," I said, hesitant. "They're unique." Her smile widened. "Each one is special, Cher. They choose who they belong to." Before I could respond, she reached under the table and pulled out a doll I hadn't seen before. It took my breath away. The doll looked exactly like me. Its hair was a deep chestnut brown, tied in a loose braid that mirrored the way I wore mine. Its eyes were green, just like mine, with tiny flecks of gold. Even its outfit, a patchwork dress with a splash of paint on one sleeve, felt eerily familiar. How did you?" I stammered, my skin prickling. "Don't question what's meant to be," she interrupted smoothly, pressing the doll into my hands. "She's your guardian. She'll protect you." I tried to hand it back. "I can't. It's already done," she said firmly, closing my fingers around the doll. "But you must treat her with care. She'll demand respect." "Demand respect?" I echoed, half laughing, but her expression was so grave that the sound died in my throat. "Respect," she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. I didn't know what else to do, so I thanked her awkwardly and walked away, the doll tucked under my arm. As I left the stall, I glanced back. The old woman was watching me, her head tilted, her gaze unreadable. When I got home, I set the doll on my desk in the corner of my studio. My apartment wasn't much, a small shotgun-style space above a bookstore, but it was mine. The studio, cramped as it was, had become my sanctuary. I studied the doll under the dim light of my desk lamp. Every detail, from the stitching of its clothes to the faint freckle on its cheek, mirrored me. It was uncanny. I couldn't decide if it was a masterpiece or a mockery. Shaking off the weirdness, I got to work sketching some new ideas. For the first time in weeks, I felt inspired. Maybe it was the market, or maybe it was the doll, but my creative block finally seemed to be lifting. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My apartment was dead silent, save for the hum of the fridge, but the sensation lingered. It was probably just my overactive imagination. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences began. It started small. My brushes were never where I left them, and my paints seemed to move on their own. One morning, I found the doll sitting upright in my chair, even though I distinctly remembered leaving it on the desk. Another time, the lights flickered as I walked past the studio. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just tired or forgetful. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Whenever I turned my back on the doll, I could swear I felt its glassy eyes boring into me. One evening, while I was cleaning up, I noticed a smudge of paint on the doll's tiny dress. Crimson red, the same shade I'd been using for my latest project. I hadn't touched the doll in days. I told myself it was a coincidence. On the fourth night, I woke up to a loud thud. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound had come from the studio. Grabbing a flashlight, I crept into the next room. The doll was lying face down on the floor, halfway across the room from the desk. I froze, every nerve in my body on edge. The air felt heavier, like the atmosphere before a storm. I bent down, my hands trembling, and picked up the doll. Its glass eyes glinted in the beam of the flashlight, reflecting my own terrified face. "Guardian," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Yeah, right?" But deep down, I was starting to wonder if Mama Celeste had been right. It started with whispers. At first, I thought they were the remnants of dreams, a faint murmur in the moments before waking up. But they were persistent. They would come at odd hours, curling into the edges of my consciousness like smoke. The words were soft, spoken in a rhythmic cadence that reminded me of prayers or chants. I couldn't make out much, but the bits I understood sounded like Creole. Potexian. The first time I heard it clearly, I bolted upright in bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispers stopped as soon as I turned on the light, leaving me alone in the silence of my tiny apartment. I chalked it up to exhaustion. I'd been burning the midnight oil, working on a new series of paintings inspired by my visit to the market. Stress had to be the culprit. That's what I told myself, at least. But as the days wore on, the whispers didn't go away. They grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes I heard them in the middle of the day, faintly echoing from the studio while I was in the kitchen. Other times, I thought I heard footsteps shuffling across the hardwood floor. I would rush into the studio, expecting to find someone or something, but the room was always empty. The doll never moved again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Its glass eyes seemed to follow me as I worked, its expression perpetually teetering between neutral and accusatory. "Stress," I muttered under my breath. "Just stress." I tried to keep the strangeness to myself, but Marcus was perceptive. We'd been friends since art school, and he had a knack for sniffing out my moods. When he stopped by my apartment one afternoon, unannounced as always, he took one look at me and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," he said, flopping onto my couch with all the grace of a Labrador retriever. "What's going on? Another existential crisis?" Something like that. I handed him a cup of coffee and perched on the armrest. "I've just been hearing things." Marcus grinned. "Hearing things? Like what? Angry neighbors? Ghosts?" I hesitated. "It's probably nothing. Just whispers and stuff. I'm overthinking it." He sipped his coffee, studying me. "Okay, but what's the real story? This feels more creepy Netflix special than usual." I groaned. "Fine, it's that stupid doll. That got his attention." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. "The doll? Your voodoo muse? Don't tell me you're scared of it." "I'm not scared," I snapped, but the look on his face said he didn't believe me. "It's just weird things keep happening, and sometimes, I swear, it feels like it's watching me." "Watching you," he repeated, nodding solemnly as if he were a ghost hunter on a reality show. "Well, there's your problem. You brought a haunted doll into your home. Rookie mistake." I punched his arm lightly, but his teasing grin helped ease the tension that had been building in my chest for days. "Let me see it," he said, setting his coffee down. Reluctantly, I led him into the studio. The doll was sitting on the desk, exactly where I'd left it. Marcus leaned in close, inspecting it with exaggerated curiosity. "Wow," he said, poking its tiny hand. "You weren't kidding. This thing looks just like you. Creepy as hell." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I muttered. He straightened up, smirking. "Honestly, though, it's probably good luck. Maybe it's channeling some of that voodoo magic to help with your work." Before I could respond, Marcus spun on his heel and wandered back into the living room, leaving me alone with the doll. I hesitated, then followed, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. We spent the evening watching bad horror movies, laughing at every overused trope. By the time Marcus left, I was feeling almost normal again. But when I returned to the studio, the doll was gone. I stared at the empty desk, my stomach twisting. "Marcus," I muttered, grabbing my phone. He picked up on the second ring. "What's up? Did you take the doll?" I demanded. "What? No. Why would I?" "Oh, come on. You're not seriously accusing me of stealing your little twin, are you?" I didn't know how to answer. Instead, I hung up and scoured the apartment. I checked every corner, every drawer, even under the bed. The doll was nowhere to be found. By the time I gave up, it was nearly midnight. Exhausted and uneasy, I crawled into bed, hoping sleep would bring clarity. The next morning, I woke to find the doll lying next to me on the pillow. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. Its dress was slightly rumpled, as if it had been handled, and faint scratch marks marred the wall above my bed. Later that day, I returned to the market to confront Mama Celeste. Her stall was exactly where I'd found it before, but she didn't seem surprised to see me. "You were warned," she said before I could speak. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Your spirit's path was chosen the moment you touched her." "What does that even mean?" he demanded, frustration bubbling over. "I didn't choose anything. You gave me this thing, and now." "Some paths are not chosen," she interrupted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "They are destined." I stared at her, anger warring with fear. "I don't believe in destiny." Her smile was sad. "You will." The whispers came back that night, louder than ever. The exhaustion hit me like a freight train. No matter how much I slept, I woke up feeling worse. My chest was tight, my thoughts sluggish, and my limbs weighed down as if I were walking through molasses. My once vivid paintings became dull swirls of half-realized ideas. And the whispers? They had become a near-constant hum, like an unseen swarm circling just out of reach. The nightmares were worse. In them, I was surrounded by shadowy figures chanting in unison, their voices low and guttural. The doll was always there, seated in the center of the ritual, its lifeless glass eyes glinting in the flickering candlelight. Sometimes the shadows would reach for me, their fingers stretching unnaturally long, pulling me closer until I woke with a start, gasping for air and drenched in sweat. One night, I woke to find myself paralyzed. My body wouldn't move no matter how much I willed it. A shadow stood at the foot of my bed, shifting and flickering like smoke in the wind. Its face was featureless, but I felt its gaze. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice in my mind. "You cannot resist what has already begun." By the time Marcus stopped by to check on me, I looked like a ghost. My hair was unkempt, my skin pale and blotchy, and my hands trembled constantly. "You need help, Em," he said, worry creasing his brow. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." "I can't eat," I admitted. "Every time I try, I feel like I'm choking. And the dreams, God, Marcus, the dreams." I told him everything, the whispers, the nightmares, the paralysis. I even confessed that sometimes when I looked at the doll, I swore it was breathing. I expected him to laugh, to roll his eyes and call me crazy. But to my surprise, he didn't. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Let's figure this out. Together." Our first stop was the market. I was hoping to find Mama Celeste and demand answers, but her stall was gone. Not just clothes gone. The table, the chairs, the fabric, the eerie dolls. It was as if she'd never been there. When I asked the other vendors about her, most of them just shook their heads or looked away. One woman, an older vendor selling hand-woven baskets, hesitated before leaning in close. "Celeste," she whispered. "She's been gone a long time, Cher. But if you're smart, you won't go looking for her." "Why?" I pressed, but the woman just crossed herself and muttered something in Creole before turning her back to me. Determined not to give up, Marcus and I scoured the city for information about Mama Celeste. We visited libraries, pored over old newspaper articles, and even combed through online forums about New Orleans folklore. What we found wasn't comforting. Mama Celeste, it seemed, had once been a well-known figure in the city. Decades ago, she was rumored to be a powerful practitioner of voodoo, feared for her ability to exact revenge on those who wronged her. One story claimed she'd cursed an entire family after they refused to pay her for a ritual, leaving them plagued by misfortune until their deaths. Another spoke of how she'd used dolls to trap the souls of her enemies, controlling their lives like a puppeteer. Most people dismiss the stories as urban legends, but the few who believe them spoke of a derelict house on the outskirts of the city, a place tied to Celeste's darker rituals. Marcus was reluctant at first. "This sounds like the plot of every bad horror movie ever," he said, but I convinced him we had no other leads. The house was exactly as you'd expect, dilapidated, overgrown with ivy, and reeking of mildew. The windows were boarded up, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. As we stepped inside, the wooden floor groaned under our weight, echoing through the cavernous space. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the faint scent of burning sage lingered. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, their jagged lines etched deep into the wood. They looked ancient, their meanings lost to time, but brimming with a palpable sense of unease. It was in the back room that we found the murals. They covered every inch of the walls, sprawling and chaotic. Human figures twisted and writhed, their faces contorted in agony. Strings connected them to oversized dolls, whose hands were manipulated by shadowy figures that loomed above. The doll's glass eyes gleamed unervingly in the dim light, and in the corner of one mural, I saw her, my doll. It was unmistakable, the same chestnut hair, the same green eyes. And in the figure's hands, clutched tightly to her chest, was a miniature version of herself. The imagery spiraled downward, depicting the figure being swallowed by darkness, her body growing more doll-like in every frame until she was completely lifeless. "That's you," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "Emily, that's—" "I know." I interrupted, my throat tight. Before we could process what we were seeing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Marcus grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but something held me back. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, and they seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. "We need to leave," Marcus said, his voice trembling. But I couldn't move. My gaze was locked on the mural, on the figure that looked like me. Her eyes seemed to glint, almost knowingly, as if she were daring me to understand the full weight of what was happening. Finally, Marcus yanked me toward the door, breaking the spell. As we stumbled out into the night, the whispers followed us, trailing like a shadow we couldn't escape. Back in my apartment, I stared at the doll, now sitting on my desk as if it had never left. My reflection stared back at me from its lifeless eyes. I realized then that the doll wasn't just a symbol. It was a warning, and I was running out of time. I first noticed it when I woke up in the park. It was past midnight, and the wrought iron benches were empty save for me. The humid New Orleans air clung to my skin, and my clothes were damp as if I'd been walking in the mist. The last thing I remembered was falling asleep in my bed. Now I was here, barefoot, with no idea how I'd gotten across the city. The doll was in my arms. My chest tightened as I stared at it, its lifeless eyes fixed on me. I wanted to throw it away, to leave it behind, but my fingers refused to let go. Trembling, I shoved it into my bag and began the long walk home, my heart pounding with every step. It kept happening. One evening, I came to standing at the edge of the Mississippi River, my shoes soaked through as the water lapped at my ankles. Another time, I found myself in a narrow alley, my hands scratched and bloody as if I'd been clawing at something. Always, the doll was with me, tucked into my arms like a cursed talisman. Marcus was the first to say what I didn't want to admit. "You're losing time," he said, watching me warily from across the coffee table. "You're not just blacking out, Emily. It's like you're being controlled." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. He found me 2 days earlier wandering the French Quarter, muttering in Creole I didn't understand. When he grabbed my shoulder, I turned to him with a blank stare, as if I didn't even recognize him. I didn't remember any of it. "It's the doll," I whispered, clutching my coffee cup so hard my knuckles turned white. "It's doing something to me." Marcus leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Then we need to figure out what it's doing and how to stop it." Marcus dove into research while I tried to keep myself from unraveling completely. He spent hours sifting through old folklore and dusty books, cross-referencing every mention of voodoo dolls and spiritual manipulation he could find. Finally, he called me over, his voice tinged with urgency. "I think I found something," he said, pushing a yellowed page across the table. The text was faded, but the illustration caught my attention immediately. A doll tied with red thread, identical to the one sitting on my desk. The accompanying text described a curse known as Lame Dirobi, the stolen soul. It was said to transfer a fragment of a person's spirit into a doll, binding their essence and making them vulnerable to manipulation. The victim would slowly lose control of their actions until they were entirely subsumed. "That's what's happening to you," Marcus said, his expression grim. "The doll isn't just tied to you, it's stealing you." Desperation drove us to drastic measures. "This thing needs to go," Marcus said, his voice firm as he set the doll on the floor of his backyard. He doused it in lighter fluid, the pungent smell filling the air, and lit a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the doll in seconds. But as the fire crackled, a searing pain tore through my chest. I screamed, collapsing to my knees as the agony spread like wildfire. It felt like my skin was peeling away, like my very soul was being torn apart. "Stop! Stop!" I begged, clawing at the ground as tears streamed down my face. Marcus panicked, kicking dirt over the flames until the fire sputtered out. The moment the flames died, the pain subsided. I lay trembling on the ground, gasping for air as Marcus knelt beside me. "Emily," he whispered, his voice shaking. I think it's connected to you. Destroying it destroys you." Back in his apartment, Marcus paced while I sat slumped on his couch, clutching my arms. The pain had faded, but a faint, aching burn remained, a cruel reminder of how close I'd come to oblivion. "We can't destroy it," Marcus said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "Not like that. Then what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's killing me, Marcus. Piece by piece, it's killing me." He knelt in front of me, gripping my hands tightly. "We find Celeste. She's the only one who can break this." "But we don't even know where she is," I said, my voice cracking. "We'll find her," Marcus said, his tone resolute. "We have to." Our search led us deeper into the shadows of New Orleans. Marcus called in favors from old friends and dug through online forums, chasing every whisper of Celeste's name. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, until we got a tip from a man who claimed to know her. "She don't stay in the city no more," he said, glancing around nervously as if afraid to be overheard. "But there's a place out in the swamps. Folks say she still does her work there." The swamps. Of course. It made sense. If anyone could disappear into the labyrinth of waterways and moss-covered trees, it was Celeste. We arrived at the edge of the swamp at dusk. The air was thick with humidity, and the buzzing of insects was deafening. Marcus carried a flashlight and a machete, while I clutched the doll against my chest, my fingers trembling. The path was narrow and overgrown, twisting through the dense foliage. The deeper we went, the heavier the air felt, as if the swamp itself were pressing down on us. Finally, we saw it, a small cabin, barely visible through the trees. A faint light flickered in the window. "This is it," Marcus whispered, gripping my arm. "Are you ready?" "No," I admitted, but I followed him anyway. We stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under our weight. Marcus raised his fist to knock, but before he could, the door swung open. Celeste stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes gleaming in the dim light. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been expecting you," she said. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried plants, bones, and other unidentifiable objects. In the center of the room was a low table, covered in candles and more of the strange symbols we'd seen before. Celeste motioned for us to sit. "You've come to break the bond," she said, her voice calm but heavy with implication. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, I need you to undo it." She tilted her head, studying me. "The bond was forged by your touch. It cannot be undone without sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Marcus asked, his tone wary. Celeste's smile widened. "A choice," she said cryptically. "But once made, it cannot be undone." The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by a cluster of candles scattered across a low altar. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, amplifying the sinister energy that hung in the air. Marcus and I stood frozen as Mama Celeste's words settled over us like a shroud. "A choice," she repeated, her voice coldly matter-of-fact. "To break the bond, there must be balance. Life for life." I shook my head, clutching the doll tighter against my chest. "No, y whispera. There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said simply, as if we were discussing the weather. "Your essence fuels the doll, child. As long as it exists, it will continue to consume you. Unless—" Her gaze flicked to Marcus, her meaning unmistakable. Marcus stepped between us, his body tense. "You can't be serious," he said. "There has to be some other way." Celeste's lips curled into a thin smile. "The universe always demands a price. The question is, who is willing to pay it?" Before either of us could respond, a low humming filled the air. It came from the back of the cabin, rising in volume until the walls seemed to vibrate. Celeste turned and gestured for us to follow her through a narrow doorway. The sight that greeted us on the other side made my stomach lurch. The room was filled with dolls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each seated on wooden shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. They came in all shapes and sizes, but their glass eyes were eerily uniform, reflecting the flickering candlelight with unsettling clarity. "They're watching," Celeste said, her voice reverent. "Each one holds a soul, a fragment of a life once bound by pain or regret. I free them from their burdens and give them purpose." "Purpose?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. This is slavery. You're trapping them." Celeste turned to him sharply, her expression darkening. "I am their salvation. These fragments are useless without guidance, scattered pieces of broken souls. I make them whole." Her words sent a chill down my spine. My gaze darted to the dolls, and I saw it then, how some of their features were disturbingly human. One had freckles like a child's, another bore the faint wrinkles of age. The truth hit me like a blow to the chest. "These aren't just fragments," I said, my voice shaking. "They're people." Celeste tilted her head, as if amused. "They were people," she corrected. "And now, there's so much more." My knees buckled, and Marcus caught me before I collapsed completely. "Emily," he said urgently, gripping my shoulders, "we have to get out of here." But before we could move, Celeste raised a hand. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, and the candles flared brighter, their flames twisting into unnatural shapes. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. "You came to me for help," Celeste said, her voice echoing strangely. "But you don't understand what you're asking. Breaking the bond will require more than courage. It will require sacrifice." She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto Marcus. "You," she said, her tone almost gentle. "You would give anything for her, wouldn't you?" Marcus didn't flinch. "If it means saving her, yes." "No," I choked out, grabbing his arm. "You can't. Marcus, please." He looked at me, his expression pained but resolute. "Emily, I can't just watch this thing destroy you. If this is what it takes, you don't know what she'll do," I said desperately, tears streaming down my face. "We can find another way. We can." "There is no other way," Celeste interrupted, her voice ringing with finality. She extended a hand toward Marcus. "The choice is his." Time seemed to freeze as Marcus stepped forward. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with an aching sadness. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're going to be okay." Before I could stop him, he placed his hand in Celeste's. The ritual began immediately. The candles flared brighter, their flames turning an unnatural shade of red. Celeste chanted in a low, guttural voice, her words incomprehensible but heavy with power. Marcus's body tensed, his jaw clenched in pain as the light seemed to drain from his eyes. I screamed, reaching for him, but an invisible force held me back. All I could do was watch as Celeste completed the ritual, her voice rising to a crescendo. When it was over, Marcus collapsed to the floor, motionless. The room fell silent, save for my ragged sobs. Celeste turned to me, holding the doll in her hands. Its features had changed. The hair was darker, the eyes a familiar shade of brown. It was no longer a reflection of me. It was Marcus. "You're free," she said simply, handing me the doll. I recoiled, staring at her in horror. "You call this freedom?" I whispered. "You're a monster." Celeste didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the doll and Marcus's lifeless body. I don't remember how I got home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my bed clutching the doll to my chest. It stared up at me, its glass eyes eerily lifelike. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice cracking. For a moment, I thought I saw its lips twitch, as if trying to form words. Then it was still again, its expression frozen in a haunting approximation of my best friend. I set it on my desk, unable to look at it any longer. As I turned to leave the room, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Emily." I didn't turn around. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.